the end of the last lesson, we were talking about the Spanish Armada, and we left it out there being readied. Remember I told you that Philip II was taking his fleet of ships into Spain's Cadiz harbor because he wanted to use those ships to defeat the British. But remember the big problem here. The Pope had divided the world in half, and he gave part of that world to Portugal and part of it to Spain, and so England was not happy with that. And we already know that England had this man named Drake, remember the dragon, who was giving Spain fits, and Drake decided he was going to challenge Spain's monopoly. So Drake took 30 ships into the harbor, and he destroyed thousands of tons of supplies. And by doing that, he delayed Spain's attack on Britain for 1 year. All right, but Spain decided, okay, we've got to regroup. I still want to make sure that I'm attacking England. So in 1588, the Spanish Armada entered the English Channel. At this point, they had 130 ships. Now, the English ships were smaller than the Spanish ships, and they were faster than the Spanish ships. But the problem was the Spanish had reinforcements in the Netherlands. So Spain had the advantage. But one thing you have to remember is it does not matter who has the advantage, because we know that God is in control. And God sent what was called the Protestant wind. The Protestant wind was a wind, an actual wind that destroyed much of the fleet. And Spain was left with wrecked ships on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. So we see that England did not have to defeat the Spanish Armada. God defeated the Spanish Armada. Now let me ask you a question. How does the defeat of the Spanish Armada affect the United States? Think about it. We want to make sure that we're looking at world events and seeing how they are interpreted in the United States. Well, because the Spanish Armada was defeated, that meant that England then had supremacy. England was now the ruler of the seas, and that meant that England was able to control America. Ooh, English control of America? Remember, we've talked about how is it that we started off with Spaniards coming here to start with, but yet we ended up being a colony, being 13 colonies controlled by England. Well, the defeat of the Spanish Armada had a lot to do with that. So at this point, 1588, England was ready to start exploring and to start colonizing. And we're going to actually talk about all that colonization that takes place in the next chapter. All right, but this has finished up one section of this chapter, and I promised you a quiz. So I would like for you to take that quiz now. If you do not already have that quiz out, you need to get it from your printed packet. The quiz looks like this. It is quiz 2 because you've already had one quiz for this chapter. You should have that quiz out. Now is the time that I want you to take that quiz. So I'd like for you to please pause the program and take the quiz. Now, I've asked your parents to grade that quiz so that we can go on with the material that we need to. So just set it aside, or even go give it to your parents if you would like to. Get out your notes ready to talk about some Englishmen. Remember, we said that the English had claims to North America through an explorer that landed up in Newfoundland. Well, now the English are starting to say, okay, we could go over there and start to colonize. And there was a man by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh. This is probably a name that you recognize. In the year 1584, by the way, this is 4 years before the defeat of the Spanish Armada, he wrote a discourse of Western planting. Now, what this book was is a compilation of arguments favoring colonization of North America. In other words, he said, I'm interested in planting, not vegetables, but I'm interested in planting colonies over in that new world. But he had to convince somebody. I mean, after all, doing this was very expensive, and so he had to say, hey, look, these are the reasons why I think we should do this. Let's go ahead and look at some of his reasons. His first reason was this will expand Protestantism. Now remember what government was like back at this time. There was no separation between church and state. The government wanted to rule people in order to promote its religion. England was Protestant. He said, this is a great land. We can send people over there and we can make that land Protestant as well. Another suggestion he gave was this will boost trade and our national influence. After all, if we establish colonies over there, we can start to trade with those colonies. And look how widespread our influence will be. We have influence not only right here in England, but also clear across the ocean. Then he had another great idea. He said, you know, we've got some people that are unemployed here. And if we established colonies, that would reduce unemployment. Because we could say, hey, you know what? There are plenty of jobs to be had over there. There's plenty of work to be done. There's nothing there. All this stuff has to be built. We've got to have ships and so forth. And so that was another good idea. And he said we could also establish military outposts. We could put our army over there, and that would allow us to protect our land. Hey, that gives the military something to do. It also means that we could perhaps expand a little bit more. Now, these are just 4 of his arguments, but he presented these arguments in the discourse to the Queen. And the Queen listened to his arguments, and she thought, hey, you know, this sounds pretty good. So in the year 1585, permission was granted to settle in Virginia. Now, this land was not just the land that we think about as being Virginia today. It was actually a much larger area than that. And it was named in honor of the Virgin Queen, who was Queen Elizabeth. Now, Raleigh's the one that got permission from the Queen to do this, but he did not actually come to America himself. Instead, he sponsored an expedition to settle on Roanoke Island. So in the year 1585, notice he didn't waste any time. Permission was granted, and boy, he got this settlement started on Roanoke Island. There's a problem, though. The settlement did not last very long, mainly because the men were looking for gold. Think about what their view of this new world was. They had seen what Spain had done with the new world. Spain had been traveling across, back and forth the seas to the new world. They were further south. They were finding lots of gold, getting rich. So these men come and they think, well, you know what? The Spaniards found all this gold. We're going to find this gold as well. So that's what they're searching for. They didn't find it. But you know what? Because they were searching for gold, they also didn't find food. And they had winter coming, and it makes wintering very rough if you do not have food. So they just had to go back again because that just didn't work for them to be able to establish a colony here. But Raleigh believed, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So 2 years later, in the year 1587, he financed a second expedition to Roanoke Island. And they called the settlement Raleigh, naming it after him. Now, that first expedition was just men, the gold seekers, but this expedition included families. In fact, shortly after they got here, a baby was born. Her name was Virginia Dare, and perhaps you are familiar with that name. Now, this group of 117 people that came, well, now that Virginia's here, it's 118 people, faced another problem. Their problem was they knew they needed to plant crops, but they arrived too late to plant them. It was too close to winter. And so they were running out of supplies. So they had a governor that was there, and they sent him back to England. They said, hey, you go back and get supplies. We'll wait for you here. But there was a problem. Did you notice the date that this colony was started? The year was 1587. What was happening in 1587? Remember, Drake was down there in Spain defeating the Spanish Armada, and then in 1588, that's when the Spanish Armada came to England, and England was busy with the Spanish Armada. So we have the problem that the governor could not return to the New World because the Spanish Armada situation was going on. England needed all of the ships. So it wasn't until after the defeat of the Spanish Armada that he was finally able to return. And when he did, he found an empty town. He also found a word written on a tree, and this word is Croatoan. Now, the question is, what happened to these people? What does this word have to do with? Were these people massacred? There were no signs of struggle. Perhaps they could have joined an Indian tribe. There was a Croatoan tribe near Raleigh, and we don't really know what happened to them. It is possible that they just went deeper and deeper into the woods. We just really don't know. But you think about Sir Walter Raleigh, and it kind of makes you feel sorry for him and feel sorry for Queen Elizabeth. Raleigh spent about $80,000. And guess what? His profit was zero. And in 1603, Elizabeth I dies, and she has no colonies to show for her efforts. Well, obviously, there are some problems in the New World at this time. So it's time that they regroup and come up with a new strategy. So England developed what are called joint stock companies. Now, the first joint stock companies operated on the same principle as modern corporations do. You had a large number of private citizens that contributed money to the company in return for a share in its profits. So the company used this pool of money to make hopefully a profit, and if they did make a profit, they would return it proportionately to the shareholders. And joint stock companies offered several advantages that we didn't have before. First thing was you had large financial undertakings that were more practical at this point. There was no need to find just one or two wealthy people to act as sponsors. You didn't have to find your Sir Walter Raleigh that could give enough money to be able to do this. Another thing that joint stock companies did was to encourage production and strengthen the economy. You see, joint stock companies were a major factor in the rise of the middle class, especially if you compare their state at this point in history to the extensive poverty during the Middle Ages. You had a lot of people saying, hey, I could put in a little bit toward that, instead of just the rich people running everything. Another advantage of the joint stock company is that it allowed private citizens to gain profit with comparatively little risk. Now, it's true that investors could have lost the amount of their original investment. However, they could not be held responsible for the debts or the liabilities of the entire company. So you could look at it and say, hey, well, I've got $100 I could give toward this. You could give your $100. That's all you could lose. You couldn't lose more than that. They couldn't come back to you and say, hey, this company went under. You're going to have to pay for it, because you were only liable for the amount that you had put into it. They also encouraged stability, because the company's leaders were now responsible not to one person or two people, but to a large number of stockholders. If you're responsible to a lot of people, you are going to make sure that you make good decisions, and that makes for a stable situation. Well, one of these joint stock companies that was developed was called the Plymouth Company. And the Plymouth Company right away started to send people out. They had 44 men that they sent to the area that is now Maine, and they were sent in the summer of 1607. The settlement that they developed was called St. George. Now, this settlement only lasted a year. Those who were still alive at the end of the year returned to England. So we don't study much about the settlement of St. George. There was another company, though. This company was called the London Company. Later it was renamed the Virginian Company, so you'll see it listed as both London Company and Virginian Company. Now, this is a company that settled the land of Virginia, and just like I mentioned before, this is not the same thing that we think of as Virginia, but it's really the land stretching from Maine all the way south to the Carolinas. And in 1607, they sent people out to Jamestown. This was on the James River. Now, the town and the river were named for King James. By the way, this is the same King James as the King James Bible. This area was in the Chesapeake Bay. Now, to get people and to be able to finance this trip, they sold stock to pay for the company. They called this stock bills of adventure, because they thought people were taking an adventure going to this new world. They also ran a lottery, and if you won the lottery, you won the adventure. I'm not sure whether that's something people would have wanted to win or not, but that was one of the ways that they financed this trip. So let's consider Jamestown for a moment. Jamestown was really considered the first English settlement in the New World, the first permanent one, or first one that lasted for any length of time. 1607 was the date. There were 104 settlers that arrived in Jamestown. Now, many of the people who came were nobility or gentlemen. We have a problem here. You know, sometimes I think, if they would just choose the right type of people to send over here, make sure that they got their timing right, it would be a whole lot easier for them to establish colonies. But remember, they didn't know what the New World was like. They didn't understand that, okay, where are we? We're too far north. We've got to make sure we get here before a certain time. They didn't know all that. So anyway, they'd sent this nobility over here, these gentlemen, people who were not used to getting dirt under their fingernails, and people who were not willing to work. Their attitudes came from the pecking order that was in England. You see, they were at the top of that pecking order. They did not have to do manual labor in England, so they didn't understand why they should have to do it when they came to the New World. Well, the problem then is they have so many nobility, so many gentlemen, that they didn't have enough people to clear the land and to plant the crops. They also chose a very poor location. Jamestown was in this low, swampy area. If you've ever been to the coast, you'll see there's a lot of swampy area there. The water was impure. They had a problem with diseases like malaria and typhoid fever and dysentery. They also chose the wrong crop. They tried to grow tobacco to make the colony pay. But the problem is you can't eat tobacco. So by the end of the first winter, disease and hunger had killed half of them. And it was written of that first year at Jamestown that men were destroyed with cruel diseases as swellings, afflictions, burning, fevers, and by wares, and some departed suddenly. But for the most part, they died of mere famine. Now you'll notice the spelling's different. That's because this was written by somebody who was actually there. Now part of the problem here was that men were still looking for gold instead of looking for food. You'd think they would learn. Some of them didn't even have a knowledge of hunting and fishing. They didn't know how to do that. So then we have a man by the name of Captain John Smith who arrives on the scene. Now what do you know about Captain John Smith? You probably already know quite a bit about him. If you've not already read it, check out that interest box on page 14. It gives you some interesting information about this man. We find out that he is a man who had fought with the Turks in Hungary, and he had decapitated 3 of them. We find out that he was captured by the Turks and he was enslaved. He killed his master and escaped through Russia. Boy, what kind of guy is this guy? He makes it back in England just in time to save Jamestown. And when he gets there, he imposes strict discipline. So we see that even though his background is not something we would look at and say, that's the kind of man we want here, he did work out very well in the colony. His philosophy came from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. He says, if any would not work, neither should he eat. Now something else he did when he got here is he explored the area around Jamestown and he mapped it out. On one of his explorations, he was captured by the Powhatan Indians. And then he was rescued by Chief Powhatan's daughter, who is Pocahontas. Now, let me just insert something here about the Native Americans. The stereotypical image from many history books and from the media is merely that the whites exploited the Indians. Now, I don't want to whitewash the record of enslavement and removals and killings. However, you need to realize that there's more to this story than that. The Native Americans had a very complex relationship with the European settlers during the colonial era. And you might even want to do a little research of your own and find some positive ways that the Native Americans interacted with the newcomers. And we will talk about that more in chapter 3. But we see that under Captain John Smith's leadership, things were looking good for Jamestown, finally. And then the Virginia Company decided they needed to set up a governor. So they sent a man by the name of Lord Delaware. Lord Delaware. And he was detained in England. So, they sent him, but he didn't make it there. So he instead sent a man by the name of Sir Thomas Gates. Sir Thomas Gates brought 9 ships and 500 men. Problem. Notice we're having a lot of problems. The problem here was that Gates and 100 of the men crashed on Bermuda in the Bahamas. So that meant that 400 men without any leader arrived in Jamestown. And these men were very unruly, and they were a big drain on the food supply that Captain John Smith had amassed. So around this time, John Smith was also injured in a gunpowder explosion, and he was sent back to England. So we have a really sad situation here in October of 1609. At this point, we have no leaders. We have no food or very little food. We have problems with disease, and we have problems with the Indians. The situation does not look good. In fact, the situation was almost one that brought death to the entire colony. We call the year 1609 to 1610 the starving time, and I think you can imagine why. In fact, let me read to you something that was written about this time. Then having fed upon horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, rats, and mice. And now famine, beginning to look ghastly and pale in every face, that nothing was spared to maintain life, and to do those things which seem incredible. Life was extremely hard. This is not just that people hadn't eaten for a couple days and they were hungry. They would eat anything that was edible at this point. Well, Gates, remember his ship had wrecked earlier, he finally arrived, and when he arrived he found only 60 settlers left. All of the poultry and livestock had been eaten, including the horses. One man is even rumored to have eaten his wife. The conditions were sickening there. And in June of 1610, the settlers decided, we're going back. We cannot stay here. Now, let's do the math here for just a moment. How many people did we start with? We started with 104 people in the year 1607, and then half of them died the first winter, so we need to subtract 52, leaving us with 52. Then we had 400 unruly men that came. That gives us a total of 452, but we didn't have food for all of those. And we had 392 people that died during the starving time. That's what leaves us with just 60 people. So the question is, was this the end of Jamestown? Well, it could have been. They were leaving, they were going back, but they didn't get very far because they were met at the mouth of the James River by Lord de la Warr. Hey, the guy that was supposed to be coming a year earlier, finally, he's able to come, and he brought with him 150 men and supplies. That's exactly what they need. So they did not continue on to England. They turned their ships around and returned to Jamestown and stayed there for good. And this time the colony prospered. There was no gold, there were no empires, there was no fountain of youth, but in 1612, a man by the name of John Rolfe begins cultivating tobacco from the Caribbean. And tobacco becomes the main cash crop. Now notice tobacco was a good thing at this point, even though it was not good earlier. Why not? It wasn't good earlier because the people didn't have food to eat. But at this point, they had established their gardens and had established that the fact that they were getting food for their families. So now they could move on and they could work on something that they could sell back to England. People were planting tobacco everywhere. They were planting it in the streets. Anywhere it would grow, they had tobacco planted. They were so consumed with planting tobacco that they even had to make a law ordering people to plant a certain amount of edible crops for every field of tobacco that they planted. Now this is the good news. The bad news is that the relations between the settlers and the Powhatan Indians was getting worse. Now, we usually think of the Native Americans as capturing the white men, but in this case, the colonists captured Pocahontas, and she lived with them for a while. And this did become a good thing because she eventually married John Rolfe and formed an alliance with the Powhatan Indians. And she was even baptized into the Anglican Church. And when she was baptized, they gave her an Anglican name, an English name, and that is Lady Rebecca. So you'll see that Pocahontas is known by both of those names. Now, Jamestown as a colony set some precedents for the New World. They relaxed some of the strict laws that they had in England. One of the laws being they'd chop off your hand if you stole something. Okay, they did not do that in Jamestown. They also gave their settlers the rights of Englishmen. In other words, they said, hey, you're over here in a new world, but this world is run by England, so we are going to give you the same rights that the Englishmen have. And in 1619, they established the House of Burgesses. And this was their government. It was modeled after the English Parliament. By the way, this was the first representative government in the New World. This year, 1619, is also the year that women were brought to the colony. In fact, they had a situation very similar to a mail order bride. They had women that came for the purpose of being married, and many of the men would advertise for a wife because they wanted to rear families in this new country. It was like, no, I'm here, I'm planning to stay here, I want someone to come over here so that I can get married and establish my own family. Then in 1619, we had something else happen too, and that's when slavery started. Now, slavery eventually replaced indentured servanthood. We've talked a little bit about what an indentured servant is, and we'll continue to talk about that in the next several chapters. So we see that there were some bad situations coming. Slavery was not something that was good, but yet it was a precedent that was established way back in 1619. By the year 1660, do you know that blackness was equated with slavery in Virginia? So it wasn't just slavery, it was, no, we're taking those African Americans, and they're the ones that we're making to be our slave. The ocean that separated this country from the mother country helped them gain independence in their government. The government that they were establishing now, these local political systems, had more relevance to them than did His Majesty's government. They were not concerned so much with what was going on in England. They were concerned with what is going on right here in our land. Now that gets us through this chapter, and I realize this has been a lot of information, but this chapter has had a number of, well, I like to call them puzzle pieces, historical facts that we have been able to put together. As we look at the puzzle, we see that there was European interest in the riches of the Orient. There was a quest for new trade routes. There was the discovery of the New World. There were Native Americans. There was riches and greed. We had conquistadors and early explorers. We had changes in religious thinking, the Reformation that happened. We had rivalries and battles, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and we had the hardships of early settlers. And I trust that at this point that you can see now how all of those puzzle pieces fit together. And they fit together to shape the nation that we now know as the United States of America. Consider the United States of America for just a minute. What does it look like? Well, things have changed a lot from those beginning times. No, the land boundaries are still the same, even though they didn't know exactly what the boundaries were. But one thing that we should see when we look at North America, when we look at the United States, is we should see not just land, not just people, but we should see God's providence in settling North America. How had God preserved North America from European influence prior to the Age of Discovery? He put an ocean between the two continents, didn't he? And to me, it's wonderful for us to see how God used those Muslim blockades of the land routes to the Orient to further His plans for the United States. Remember, we talked about the fact that in 1488, we had Diaz rounding the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Da Gama sailed to India by way of Africa, and Da Gama followed Diaz's path and continued on to India. And of course, between those two events, we know what else happened. We know that Columbus found the New World. But remember, God didn't allow the settling of this new continent until after the Reformation. And both the discovery of the New World and the Reformation were triggered by the rebirth of learning during the Renaissance. So we have all these different elements of history working together to see how America was settled. But even with that Reformation, remember, Spain remained Catholic, and Spain pretty much had first claims to the New World. But remember the year 1588? That was one of the things that resulted in English settlement of the New World. There was also something that happened in the year 1517. Let's back way up. What happened then? Kind of review of the events. That's when Luther posted his 95 Theses. Now, what do his 95 Theses have to do with the defeat of the Spanish Armada? Well, think about why they were in conflict. The conflict between Spain and England was over religion, and England would likely have not been in that same type of conflict with the Catholic Church and thus with Spain if the Protestant tradition had not been established by Martin Luther. And had the Spanish Armada not been defeated, England would not have been settling America. Spain would have done it. So the victory of Protestant England over Catholic Spain helped preserve the outcome of the Reformation. And this new land provided a place for persecuted believers to seek refuge. Now, what about political consequences of the defeat, especially for America? Can you think of any? I'd like for you to try. I'd like for you to pause the program and ask yourself, what were the political consequences of the defeat, especially for America? Very quickly, let me just mention to you here that now, because of this, victorious England would dominate the sea, would dominate trade, would dominate colonization, and most of America would be English-speaking, would be capitalist, would be Protestant. Philip II's greatness ended at this point. Spain was no longer a major player in the modern age, and under Elizabeth I, England began its ascendancy as a world power, reaching its zenith in the 19th century. All of this information has been in Chapter 1. Your assignment for today is going to be to take a test over Chapter 1. Before you do that, I want you to study very carefully. Make sure that you have read the entire chapter. Make sure that you have done the section review questions. Make sure that you have completed that study guide. And make sure that you really study the study guide in preparation for your test.